Welcome, everyone, to United States History to 1877. This is Chapter 10, Religion and Reform. In this lecture, you will learn all of the following. 1. The Second Great Awakening swept the United States, creating new religions and interpretations of Christianity. 2. The new religious belief encouraged criticism of slavery, alcohol, and encouraged women's rights. 3. More people sought an individual relationship with God, often through participation in nature. And 4. Abolitionism pushes the country closer to violence and war. The early 19th century was a period of great change in the United States. Economic, political, social, and territorial transformations radically changed how Americans thought about themselves, their neighbors, and their nation. Generally, people were optimistic, supported by a strong religious perspective that saw divine power at work in America. There was also great conflict, as the benefits of the industrialization and democracy transformations fell overwhelmingly to white men, leaving women, Native Americans, and African Americans behind. Western expansion, along with transportation and technology changes, connected different regions that grew to be very different cultures. Americans were enthusiastic and suspicious. Religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening reignited Protestant spirituality, creating new religious communities that believed human society could be made better. Tackling the major problems facing society, such as alcoholism, slavery, and women's rights, these reformers worked to remake the world. The Second Great Awakening brought religion to the people through camp meetings, revival festivals that brought a new sense of spiritual community to Americans struggling with the changes of the Industrial Revolution. Church membership at this time grew quickly, and new versions of Christianity were born, inspiring social reform. The ranks of Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians grew alongside new denominations like Seventh-day Adventists, Unitarians, and Mormons. Radical revivalist preachers like Charles Finney appealed not only to the Bible, but directly to his followers' hearts and emotions. Like many others, he proclaimed an equality with all under the eyes of God, but that God's will and surrender to it was essential. Spiritual equality matched well with American beliefs. As a result, anyone could preach the Bible, a break from traditions that insisted on a professional priesthood. Many preachers founded their own churches, claiming God had spoken directly to them. Mormon founder Joseph Smith claimed God had given him the only true church and added the Book of Mormon to the biblical tradition in 1830. And he founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As more and more followers joined Joseph Smith, his movement was pushed out of towns in the eastern United States as it competed politically and was seen as a threat to other churches. As the Mormon tradition grew, its secrets did as well, making some in the public suspicious. And when the Mormon Church encouraged the practice of multiple wives, Joseph Smith was ultimately murdered by a mob in 1844. Mormons continued to be persecuted for their beliefs, despite the freedom of religion promised to all in the Constitution. Unitarians and their followers rejected the divinity of Jesus Christ, a message promoted by many American intellectuals at the time. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were two of the most outspoken members of this movement. The movement celebrated individualism and optimism, personal spiritual experience, and a vision based on looking to the future rather than to the past. Seeking oneness with nature was a practice of transcendentalist spirituality, where divine connection, independence, and moral living could be achieved. Thoreau wrote about this in his own transcendental experience in his famous book, Walden. During the antebellum period, or the years leading up to the Civil War, many American Christians responded to industrialization by organizing to meet specific social needs. Encouraging church membership through evangelical outreach was seen as a way to combat drunkenness, vice, and crime. Voluntary benevolent societies published and distributed Protestant teachings. They taught Sunday school and spread the word to both frontier towns and urban slums. They supported large-scale reform projects to curb alcohol consumption, to abolish slavery, and to improve the political and economic rights of women. Evangelicals sought to create what was called the Benevolent Empire. The anti-slavery movement had supporters in the United States as well as Europe. Abolitionism, which called for immediate rather than gradual end for slavery, had its origins in England. American abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were widely read in England. The religious beliefs of the Second Great Awakening spread the anti-slavery movement. The combination of religion and reform became known as the Benevolent Empire. One of the leaders of this reform movement was Charles Finney, who taught that the return of Jesus Christ required a 1,000-year period of peace, and ending slavery was part of that peace. Other volunteer and benevolent societies worked in a similar mission to reform prostitution, bankruptcy laws, prisons, insane asylums, labor laws, and even education. They built orphanages and opened free medical dispensaries. The most successful crusade was the temperance movement. Alcohol consumption had become a serious issue after the American Revolution, and by 1820, alcoholism had become a widespread problem across the country. The temperance reformers advocated for limits as well as full abstinence from alcohol. Temperance reformers saw a direct connection between alcohol and other problems of society, which all endangered family life. In response to the view that heavy drinking was associated with men who abused, abandoned, and neglected their families, women formed a significant presence in societies dedicated to banning alcohol. Temperance and middle-class status became connected. The reform movements of the 19th century produced reform and instituted changes that have continued through the 20th and 21st centuries. Missionaries sought to even convert Native Americans, and when Andrew Jackson tried to force the Cherokee Indians to leave Georgia in 1830, activists joined Native Americans in opposing the Indian Removal Act. Christian missionaries challenged Georgia's laws, suing in the Supreme Court case of Worcester v. Georgia. Despite winning the case, however, Andrew Jackson violated the court's decision, marching the Cherokee and others on the murderous Trail of Tears, a forced march from Georgia to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. Along the way, tens of thousands of Native Americans perished. William Lloyd Garrison became an early leader in the anti-slavery movement. In 1831, he established his newspaper, The Liberator, promoting immediate emancipation and black citizenship. In 1833, he and others founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. As abolitionists, they fought to save slaves and the soul of their nation. Most Americans did not share the abolitionist form of nationalism, however. Abolitionists remained a small, marginalized group, hated by most white Americans in both the North and the South. They were criticized as troublemakers who stirred up tensions and interfered with the national peace. White Southerners blamed them for Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion. Abolitionists were regularly threatened with violence. In the House of Representatives, a new rule was introduced restricting all abolitionist debates. In 1838, angry mobs attacked the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, and in 1840, abolitionists decided to change their approach from persuasion to resistance. Abolitionists began helping runaway slaves and created the Underground Railroad to move them from the South through the northern states and on to Canada. One of the leaders of this movement was Harriet Tubman, who saved not only her entire family from slavery, but went back risking her life on many occasions to free other slaves from bondage. Frederick Douglass, himself a runaway slave, spoke and wrote about slavery in his newspaper, The North Star, building support at home and abroad for the movement. Reform and resistance led to violence in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown, a devoutly religious man, believed that slavery was an insult to God and that it needed to end through violence if necessary. At Harper's Ferry, Virginia, John Brown and his family led a group of men and runaway slaves to seize the weapons at the federal arsenal. He had hoped to lead Virginia's slaves to freedom in Canada, but was caught and executed. The example of John Brown only further divided the nation, as Northerners saw him as a hero, while white Southerners saw him as a madman. The abolitionist movement paved the way for the Republican Party. Indeed, it is hard to imagine that Abraham Lincoln could have become president without radical abolitionists like John Brown, against whom Abraham Lincoln could be seen as a moderate alternative. In addition to slavery, the rights of women and the reform of society to grant them more freedom was a major effort of this time. 19th century women were expected to be religious, pure, submissive, and ultimately domestic. Historians have described these expectations on women as the cult of domesticity. During the antebellum era, as women received more education, they became more outspoken. Working in the abolitionist movement, prepared women's rights leaders like Angela and Sarah Grimke, Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony to fight for their own freedom. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for the Seneca Falls Convention, one of the first large conventions for women's rights activists to meet and organize. Modeled on the Declaration of Independence, the sentiments argued for property rights, professional lives, and the right to vote. Seneca Falls was the first of many gatherings to promote women's rights. In this lecture, we learned the following. 1. That the Second Great Awakening swept the United States, creating new religions and interpretations of Christianity. 2. The new religious beliefs encouraged criticism of slavery, alcohol, and encouraged women's rights. 3. More people sought an individual relationship with God, often through participation in nature. And 4. Abolitionism pushed the country closer to violence and war. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 10, Religion and Reform, created with work from the American Yop, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University and edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with comments and narration by myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo.